The age of Obama as racial nightmare. Explain.
Yes, well, today, people around the globe, people of color in particular, have been celebrating the election of Barack Obama as kind of our nation's triumph over race and the history of racial caste in America. Yet the appearance of racial equality, the superficial appearance of racial equality that Barack Obama's election has afforded, serves to mask a deeply disturbing underlying racial reality, which is that large segments, a majority of African American men in some urban areas are either under the control of the criminal justice system or branded felons for life, locked in a permanent second-class status. This vast new racial undercaste, and I say caste, not class, because this is a population which is locked into an inferior status by law and by policy. This vast population has been rendered largely invisible through affirmative action and the appearance of success, with a handful of African Americans doing well in universities and corporations, the sprinkling of people of color through elite institutions in the United States due to affirmative action policies and the limited progress of middle class and upper middle class African Americans creates the illusion of great progress and helps to mask the underlying racial reality, which is that a racial caste system has been reborn in the United States. Young men of color in particular are labeled as felons, labeled as criminals at very young ages, often before they even reach voting age, before they turn 18. Their backpacks are searched. They're frisked on their way to school, standing, waiting for the school bus to arrive. Once they learn to drive, their cars are searched, often dismantled in a search for drugs. The drug war waged in these poor communities of color has created generations of black and brown people who have been branded felons and relegated to a permanent second-class status for life. And the reason for their excommunication from our society, our mainstream society, is for engaging in precisely the same kind of drug activity that is largely ignored in middle class and upper middle class white communities. People often say to me, well, if black and brown men don't want to be labeled felons, well, then they just shouldn't commit drug crimes. But we have known as a nation for a long time now that simply prohibiting drug activity does not lead people to stop using illegal drugs. We learned that lesson with alcohol prohibition. Banning the use of alcohol didn't discourage many people from using or selling alcohol. And people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites.
Well, we turn now to the second part of our interview with legal scholar, civil rights advocate, and author Michelle Alexander. Her book is The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Former director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU of Northern California, she now holds a joint appointment at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University.
We continued yesterday's interview with Michelle Alexander after the broadcast, and we started with a clip of President Obama's speech at the NAACP Centennial Celebration last year.
We've got to say to our children, yes, if you're African American, the odds of growing up amid crime and gangs are higher. Yes, if you live in a poor neighborhood, you will face challenges that somebody in a wealthy suburb does not have to face. But that's not a reason to get bad grades. That's not a reason to cut class. That's not a reason to give up on your education and drop out of school. No one has written your destiny for you. Your destiny is in your hands. You cannot forget that. That's what we have to teach all of our children. No excuses.
Michelle Alexander, no excuses. Can you respond to President Obama?
Well, I think, a major point that is often lost in debates about the so-called underclass, poor African Americans who are trapped in racially segregated ghettos. The point that's often missed is that huge percentages of the people residing in those communities have been branded felons, and therefore discrimination is perfectly legal against them. Employment discrimination is perfectly legal. Most job applications, ranging from Burger King clerk to accountant, ask whether you've been convicted of a felony. And studies show that, about 70% of employers say they won't even consider hiring someone who's been convicted of a drug felony. Public housing is off limits to you if you've been convicted of a felony. For a minimum of 5 years, you are deemed ineligible for public housing once you've been branded a felon. Discrimination in private housing markets, perfectly legal. So here you are, recently released from prison, having been branded a felon for engaging in precisely the kind of drug activity that's ignored in middle-class white communities. You're branded a felon, you can't get a job, and then public housing is off limits to you. Where are you expected to sleep? So an aunt or grandmother takes you in. Now, let's say you're one of the lucky few who managed to get a job. Well, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. That's right, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay the cost of your imprisonment. Increasing numbers of states are requiring former prisoners to pay back the cost of their imprisonment, pay back court costs, court processing fees, even the cost of their representation, even if they've been assigned a public defender, and back child support. You're required to pay back all the accumulated child support that you incurred while you were in prison. So up to 100% of your wages can be garnished, even if you're one of the lucky few who managed to get a job after being branded a felon. What is the system designed to do? The system is designed to send you right back to prison, which is, in fact, what happens to the vast majority of people who are released. About 70% of former prisoners are returned within 3 years. And the majority of those who are returned within 3 months, because the obstacles, the legal barriers to just surviving on the outside are so great. People often say to me, well, I know somebody who is a felon and who managed to get a job. It's possible to get a job, they say. Well, it may be possible, but what kind of job? Why is it that, our young kids, young black and brown kids, are expected to be locked into low-wage jobs for life if they're lucky enough to get them? But kids in other communities are given the opportunity to go on to college, to compete for a full range of job opportunities. During the Jim Crow era, the problem wasn't that black people couldn't get jobs. It was that they were locked permanently in a lower tier of jobs. And that's the reality. That's the reality. For us to tell young African-American kids in ghetto communities, your destiny is in your own hands, that may be an inspirational message. But for many of them, it may turn out to be a lie, because the rules and laws that govern ghetto communities today and the war that is being waged there ensures that a large majority of black and brown boys in those communities will be branded felons and then relegated to a permanent second-class status for life.
Michelle Alexander, I'd like to ask you about Arnold Schwarzenegger. Governor Schwarzenegger at the State of the State address in January called for privatizing some of the state's prisons.
The priorities have become out of whack over the years. Think about it. 30 years ago, 10% of the general fund went to higher education, and only 3% went to prisons. Today, almost 11% goes to prisons, and only 7.5% goes to higher education. Spending 45% more on prisons than universities is no way to proceed into the future.
Your reaction to Governor Schwarzenegger's newfound concern about the situation with the prison system in the state?
Yes, well, many people reacted with glee to Governor Schwarzenegger's kind of apparent embrace of the books not bars theme that had been a rallying cry for grassroots organizations in the state for more than a decade. But if you read between the lines there, what Schwarzenegger is actually saying is not that we should change our laws to ensure that nonviolent drug offenders don't end up spending years or decades behind bars, or that we should rethink harsh mandatory minimum sentences or our three strikes laws, which have been responsible for the prison boom in California and other states around the country. His remedy has not been to reduce prison populations through kind of rethinking draconian laws, but instead to privatize try to save money, make warehousing and caging human beings cheaper by privatizing the system.
Hello, Pegasus Lifestyle Management. How can I help you? Your beautiful new aircraft is waiting at our nearest airfield. We hope you're very happy, madam.
is a state of war exists anytime anybody tries to take from you that which is rightfully yours. It could be your life, your liberty, your pursuit of happiness, your education, your ability to move along freely in a society from point A to point B. A state of war exists anytime anybody or any system organizes against you to take your life, your liberty, your pursuit of happiness, your proper education, your ability to move from point A to point B. So we as an African people are at war. Whether or not we choose to acknowledge it is one thing or another. But as you know, if you ignore the fact that you're in a state of war, the end result usually is that you will be smashed by the fact that it exists and you have taken no actions to organize yourself. I think it's important that we also understand some basic definitions so that we understand who we're talking about, even when we say we. When I use the term we, I'm talking about African people. When I say African people, I mean those people who come from the continent of Africa who were dropped off in various places around the world. So if you're from Grenada, if you're from Panama, if you're from Guyana, if you're from Jamaica, if you're from certain parts of Latin America, these are all black people dropped off in different places in the world. That is who I'm talking about when I'm talking about African people. Why do I stress the importance of Africa? Africa is not just a power base and a land base, it's a way of life. And I think it's important for us as a people to recognize that. First of all, I think the reason why we reject Africa is because of the way that we have been portrayed in the United States media. Usually when you see pictures of Africa or commercials about Africa, what you see is a black baby with a big head and a bloated stomach. You'll see flies buzzing all over the place. Then you'll see some white woman who will come out and say, excuse me, I'm Sally Struthers. This is Abdullah. Abdullah doesn't have any food. His people have forgotten how to plant seeds. And he doesn't have a father. And you'll be surprised what 50 cents can do for Abdullah. So if you can just put it in an envelope and send it to us, we will be able to take care of Harriet's family and his entire community. Now, the normal African reaction to that is to reject that particular image because that's not an image that gives you a feeling of pride. That's not an image that makes you want to claim that particular land, and that's not an image that makes you want to claim that particular people. If you see a documentary on Africa, usually you will see some naked African people running around. You'll have some white British narrator who's trying to explain what these people are doing, and he usually has absolutely no idea what these people are doing. And you might see some type of a ceremony which involves some type of blood or some type of rituals that are never understood, never explained by the people who claim to narrate and own the footage themselves. And so what has happened is you're reinforced in a negative way about yourself. And so your self-image makes you reject yourself. And when you reject yourself, quite naturally, you destroy yourself, your community, and your own people. Most of the images of young African men today are images of criminals. Usually you can turn on the news at 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. and see several young black men being carted away by the police. Usually their heads are down, their hands are to the back, or their arms are up, leaning up against the wall or something of that nature. So the image of African people is not something that African people ourselves would want to embrace. Usually if you see an African woman on the United States media, it is something that is, she is someone who is portrayed in a negative light. She is someone who is portrayed as some type of a hooker, prostitute, oversexed, somebody who is not intelligent, one-dimensional, flat, so on and so forth. And so as a people, the main thing that we have to struggle against is embracing ourselves and rejecting the cultures of other people in terms of our own definition and understanding who we are. So I stand before you as an African woman, and I say, when I say we, I mean African people. Africa also represents a way of life and a way of thinking. To give you an example, in America, most things are based on rugged individualism. I, me, and go for self is the basic philosophy, which comes out of a capitalistic thought process. In Africa, the word I means we. I is we, and we is them, and them is they, and they is us, and us is I, and you is I. So in an African philosophy, we are all in philosophy to one another. So there's no way if you're doing bad that I can be doing good. If you're doing bad, I'm doing bad. If you're doing good, I'm doing good. So it's a philosophy. inequality that exists. And what happens is this is a philosophy that makes for a better community, makes for a better global system, makes for a better way of life. And when we reject Africa, we reject ourselves, our culture, our philosophy, our beliefs in the world. One thing that is commonly known about us is that the majority of us reject our natural selves. The majority of us reject our home base. The majority of us don't move to develop our home base. And so we represent, when we move around the world, a state of confusion and a state of misunderstanding. African people developed a way of life which taught young men what is the definition of being a man, which taught young women what is the definition of being a woman. Since we have rejected Africa and rejected the philosophy, we have a lot of young brothers and sisters in America, the majority I would say, who don't have any understanding of what it is to be a man or what it is to be a woman. So the societies that organized in ancient Africa would get together and the older women would tell younger women stories about how to deal with your relationship, how to get the fruits to the market, how to create an economic base for the family, would teach men how to be hunters, how to organize things. And so since these things have been removed and our people have been devastated, most people are not understanding how to do certain basic fundamental things as African men and African women. So we get our definitions from the television. So you have the average young black male in an inner city area believing that the definition of being a man is being a criminal. The definition of being a man is shooting people, being shot, being incarcerated, doing time at particular hardcore correctional facilities. You have young women who get their definition of womanhood from Erica Kane on All My Children, who get their definition of womanhood from Joan Collins on Dynasty, who get their definition of womanhood from white women who are divorced from their same historical understanding, divorced from their same historical experience, who didn't grow up in the projects, didn't grow up in the inner cities, and won't have the problems that are particular to African women. So when you reject your African self, you not only reject your power base, which the rest of the entire world recognizes represents a certain amount of resources, which the rest of the entire world recognizes represents a strategic military position, which the rest of the entire world recognizes represents certain mineral wealth and resource wealth. But when you fail to recognize that yourself, you fail to establish a relationship, to embrace the continent, and to develop a relationship on any level: emotional, business, social, philosophical, militarily, and as a result, you have an entire landmass that goes undeveloped for our people. Racism. Racism is a system that, based on race, denies people access to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness, to proper education, to control over their own resources. Racism is a system which denies people access based on race to those particular things. So what does that mean? That means that this term that they use, reverse racism, does not exist. Reverse racism as a term is a contradiction in words, because it insinuates that somewhere along the line, we as African people, even though the economic score, receive some type of reparations, develop institutions of education where we taught masses of white people to hate themselves and destroy themselves, develop industry where we taught African people to be producers and taught all whites to be consumers, develop the military where we drafted all white people and sent them to fight black battles. Racism is a system. So anybody who wants to know the definition of racism must know that it is a system that is predicated on the notion of power. If you as a race do not have the power to systematically deny people access to life, to liberty, to proper education, to industry, to money making, to controlling your environment, you cannot be considered a racist. So what is an African person who feels bad about white people? What is an African person who feels annoyed about racism? What is the African brother that stands on the corner and says, you know, I'm tired of all these whites? What words do we use to define him. The word that we use is prejudice. Prejudice means to prejudge a situation. And I would advise all people, as an African woman who is also an historian, that you should prejudge every situation that you encounter in the United States of America. What do I mean by that? Well, if somebody's great-great-great-grandfather had stabbed my great-great-great-grandfather in the back, and then their great-great-grandfather had... What do I mean by that? Well, if somebody's great-great-great-grandfather had stabbed my great-great-great-grandfather in the back, and then their great-great-grandfather had lied and cheated and stolen land from my great-great-grandfather, and then their great-grandfather had raped my great-grandmother, and then the grandfather had cheated and manipulated my grandfather, and father had lied and stolen from my father, what would make me think that their sons and daughters would not do the same thing? Now, I find